Good evening or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are currently situated. And welcome to Leading Responsible Technologies Interactive Q&A session. I'm Sam Kirshner, an associate professor at UNSW Business School, and your academic lead for this year's Learn to Lead, Leading the Future. I'm here with Professor Lyria Bennett Moses, who will be answering all your questions on leading responsible technology. But first, just to let you guys know where I am today, I am calling from Frankfurt, but I guess I recognize that many others are in Australia or other countries like Canada and America with unceded land. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which you're calling in from today, wherever they may be across the country, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I guess a little housekeeping for today, just kind of the way Sandeep started our previous sessions. And I guess today's interactive Q&A is an opportunity to dive deeper into the topic on leading responsible tech and for you to ask any questions that you may have on this module. But before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. So first, I'd like to extend my thanks to Sandeep for filling in for me last week while I was unwell. And I must admit, I'm a little jealous because I love chatting about Disney with Richard and all things tech with Travis. So pretty sad that I missed those opportunities. In fact, the last time I was with Richard, we were talking about the digital transformation with Disney. And, we were talking about the magic bands. And I guess it's really hard to fathom just what a big endeavor that actually was. And then he just kind of mentioned that just, they had to organize almost if you're tapping into your hotel rooms, that means that 30,000 doors need to get completely refitted. And just the logistics of that alone is just so complex. So that's just one small piece of this giant transformation. And he probably didn't get to mention some of the cooler things, but some of the stuff that they did really interact with what Travis also was talking about. And we were kind of reminiscing that one of my favorite things in Disney is the Haunted Mansion ride, because at the end they actually had, and this was back in 2014, this really cool mixed reality experience where using the magic band, they would know exactly who you are, and they would actually use your data and your info and your likeliness to actually create holograms, in which case, maybe tombstones will come and fall on and kind of say like, rest in peace, Sam, with today's date. So I just thought it was really neat that all these things are really interacting together. And what Richard and Travis both mentioned, just usually towards the end of their segments and even in the live Q&A, was really about responsible tech, which really brings us to today's session with Lyria. And I'd like to thank those who've already submitted your questions. We have handpicked some of the most popular themes that we feel that everyone will benefit from. So I'll pose these questions to Lyria and she'll answer those first. After that, we'll move on to some real-time questions, and please just post questions throughout the session using the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many as possible in the time that we have. So just as everyone knows, this webinar will be recorded and posted to Navigator, so you can access this following the session. So I guess, Lyria, the first question will be, what potential changes do you envision for the world in the next 10 years as a result of technology? And how might these advancements reshape the concept of leadership and the required skills? Now, we've asked this question in similar formats in our previous session, so please feel free to answer this either just from a responsible tech lens or just from any lens that you think, that you want to discuss in terms of the next 10 years of tech and leadership.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership. I'm always very hesitant to ever predict or forecast what's going to happen over long time periods like 10 years with respect to technology. I was actually sitting in a meeting with government today, reminiscing on the fact that, we now talk about sort of, AI and quantum, and they're the technologies that everyone's discussing. go back about 10 years and we had the National Enabling Technology Strategy, which was all about nanotech and biotech, right? And I'm not saying those things have gone away, they haven't, but in terms of saying, where's the next big thing going to come from? Most of the time, people don't know what the real enabling technologies are until they're big. Another example is if you'd ask someone, you know, a couple of years ago about what's next in AI, everyone was talking about big data, you know, more sort of data-driven algorithms, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not sure that generative AI would have necessarily been on everyone's list. So I think it's dangerous to predict, but what we can say is that it will be unpredictable. So I think there'll be lots of predictions and then it'll be something else. But there are ways that we can think about it, right? No matter, we don't need to know exactly what the latest thing is going to be in 10 years. We can think about it now. From a leadership perspective, these questions about technology are no longer just for the R&D team or the IT department or whatever it is, right? It's boardrooms, and indeed it's really somewhere in most roles is having some sense of these things. And I really believe that everyone needs to understand what's out there. Not everyone's going to be able to build it, right? Not everyone is going to be able to design it, and not everyone's going to be able to, tell you, what's the next thing in 12 months. But everyone needs to be aware of what's out there, what it can do and what its limitations are to perform their roles well. And at the leadership end, if you're, to develop strategies, right, for how an organization is going to navigate what's there and what's on the horizon. That's as far as I'm prepared to go, horizon, as opposed to my 10-year predictions. And I think this, in terms of required skills, this goes, because it's everybody, right? It's literally everybody has to have some situational awareness around this stuff. I actually think we need to go right back to high schools and really think about what education students get there. I would like to think that when students finish high school, they know, for example, that when they do a search, they're not going to get the same answers as everyone else who does the same search. They understand the concept of filter bubbles and so forth that arise from those kinds of issues, that they understand that the prices they might get offered aren't the same for everybody. It's not like a sticker on an item in a physical store. And it's a bit like, when I was at school learning how graphs can mislead or how to compare prices of differently sized products. We did this stuff because it was important as citizens, as workers, as consumers in all our different roles that we got it. And we need to do that for some of the technologies coming through so that people are aware of and can operate in a world with the technology that is in it. So, at the very basic level, it's an everyone thing. At the leadership level, it's about having a sufficient understanding to be able to develop strategies that take into account what is possible without overestimating the extent to which any given thing is going to be what you expect it to be.
Thank you. That is very comprehensive, and I couldn't agree more. This idea of kind of prediction, I remember reading The Black Swan, and just, it's just so hard to really actually predict what will truly happen. And I think the author points out, whenever he walks into a meeting and there's projections of sales 10 years into the future, he's just like, what are you even doing? But it still doesn't mean that the skills that we need and the leadership that is something that we can forecast as being incredibly important. So our first question comes from Tamim Khashoggi, a BCom alum from Saudi Arabia. And the question is, given the nature of the international legal ecosystem, what are some of the potential ways to navigate corporations deliberately basing themselves in less regulated markets while targeting more developed and regulated markets?
Okay, so in part that depends on what kind of problem it's causing, right? Because that's a fairly broad question. So if it's causing really big problems, then law can go hard, right? So you look at something like drug enforcement. And now I'm not suggesting whether that's good policy or bad policy, it's widely debated. But the point is, if it's something that is considered really bad, you can, put people in jail for long periods of time. You could do things like that. But most of the problems we're talking about don't need that kind of heavy-handed approach, right? There's a lot of other ways of of protecting people against the kind of more often consumer harms or sort of, privacy or other things like that we might encounter when technology developed under one country's rules is being sold or used in another country. So part of the solution can be supply chain regulation, which is happening with the critical infrastructure legislation, for example. So organisations that are critical infrastructure, that have critical infrastructure assets, have to do a risk analysis that will take account of supply chain risk. So if their supply chain involves other jurisdictions where they can't make the same assumptions that they can make in Australia, that should be factored in. You can regulate users, of course, as well, directly, right? Again, doesn't always work. It's not a 100% foolproof thing, but it will, there's a lot of people who will respond to that kind of regulation. You can have import restrictions, but note the limitations on that, right? So not everything is a physical product crossing borders, and even things that are, how do you tell what's in the Amazon box half the time? You can have education. So people have faith in regulated things, for lack of a better word. You probably, people want to buy, if they buy medicine, generally speaking, they want to know what it really is, what it says on the packet. And some people might go AWOL and buy it from anywhere, but most people, don't want to buy things like food or drugs from overseas countries without the sort of equivalent level of regulation to what we have here, or something that they trust. So education can help people understand, look, if you download this product, here's the fallout. You can regulate platforms. So, if something can't be found on Google, it doesn't really exist. So in some cases, again, that's going a little bit harder, but you can do things like that. There are areas where there's development of international treaties. There are obviously the influence, although they're not mandatory, of international standards. I tend to find that generally speaking, the problem is reacting to only part of the problem. So what the government often does is it perceives some international threat and it defines it in a particular way that means it reacts to that thing. So an example of that is TikTok, with the ban on, using TikTok on government devices. It's like a tiny part of the problem of data being used by foreign countries potentially for, espionage or sort of, various purposes that, might not be, good in Australia's national interest. So, that kind of thing, you've got to respond more holistically, right? If we're really trying to protect Australian data from foreign countries, we can't just, say, oh, we've banned TikTok on certain people's devices, problem solved. We've really got to look at it more holistically and work out how far are we willing to go? How bad is this? And how much do we really want to do to stop whatever it is we're worried about? Law is an imperfect tool. So even if you go hard, right, drugs get imported into Australia. It doesn't, it's really a question of working out what is the harm that we're worried about. Is it a consumer harm, in which case maybe consumer education is one route? Is it something where there's a real national security interest, in which case we might need to go a bit harder? But it has to be responsive to the context.
Thanks. So our next question is from Jared Grogan, who is currently an MBA student in Sydney. And the question is, as AI tools become increasingly common, employers need to consider how they may impact various compliance issues within the business, including the security of client data. Is relying solely on a principled approach sufficient for addressing these risks?
So I think, when you say relying solely on a principled approach, if you just have principles and you dream them up and write them down somewhere, that's not going to actually achieve anything, right? The principles come into play in various ways. I mean, Privacy Act is a principles-based piece of legislation, or a lot of data governance principles that organizations have are based on particular principles, what's important to that organization. But if that's where you stop, right, you're not really, it's not going to have any impact on anything, right? It'll just gathering dust. I think the answer, I might put it in two different ways, right? So there's what you plan for and what you don't plan for. So for what you plan for, if you're talking about using AI tools in an organization, let's say you're rolling out an AI tool to assist with some function that has previously been performed by humans in that organization. Say pricing if you're a company, decision-making if you're a government department, whatever it is, then you should go through a full journey, right? So you should absolutely start with, what is it we're trying to achieve here? What is it we're looking for a tool to do? What are our, what does it need to, what other things does it need to manage? So if one of the things is, the security of client data, then that's going to be high up there in terms of what you want. You then go through a full journey where you take all of those things from high-level principles, right, where they inevitably start, down to something that looks a lot more like system requirements of what you actually need this tool to do and what what boxes need to be around it. And then, beyond that, you can build a system based on those requirements. You can then evaluate it. Does it actually meet it, right? You could do user testing where that's relevant. You can start small scales, so maybe start in one part of the business or and so forth. And you can sort of say, let's actually try it in a small scale. So if it goes wrong, it doesn't blow everything up. You can do all of those really good ways of rolling something out, and continuous evaluation, get feedback, talk to your stakeholders, all of that kind of stuff. And that's great, right? But that's the stuff you plan for. A lot of the problem with AI tools is in what you don't plan for. So a good example of that is something like Clearview AI. So that's the tool that police were using to identify suspects in, grainy video feeds, right? And they'd feed it into Clearview AI, and Clearview AI would give them these matches that were based on a whole bunch of photos scraped from social media, websites, who knows, right? And that wasn't, in most cases, that was not a police department going, right, this is our new identification tool, let's procure a enterprise package, let's investigate, what it says it'll do, let's evaluate how accurate it is. It wasn't any of that. It was individual police officers downloading it on their personal devices, right? And saying, this is going to help me with my investigations. And we can see the same kind of thing with sort of ChatGPT and generative AI, right? It's not always organizations saying, let's look at how this tool can improve processes or whatever in our organization. It's an individual, maybe even a really junior employee who's been told to write a report who goes, I'll get ChatGPT to help and feeds it the confidential information, the client data, and asks ChatGPT to put it into, a report that meets whatever their boss has told them to do. And so what you need there, you can't, these things are going to happen in a lot of organizations. And the most you can do there is clear internal policies, making sure employees are aware that when you put stuff into ChatGPT, it's like you're shouting it from the rooftop potentially. The terms of service vary depending on the product, but a lot of them, the data might be spewed out on someone else's screen down the line. So it's not necessarily a no to everything approach. I think if you say no to everything, people will go, they're not really serious and this is harmless. But if you really focus on where the risks are, so things like client data, things like confidential information, and you clearly communicate the why behind that, and the consequences behind not following the policy, you're more likely to have traction.
Great. So I think we're going to move now to the live Q&A. And so hopefully everyone has picked up some wisdom, and even just in these first three questions from Lyria. So I think the first question we'll start with, just because it kind of ties back to something you already said, is from Jack P. And Jack P asks or says, hi, Lyria, you mentioned that, quote, everyone needs to go back to high school, quote, regarding learning how to adopt to new technologies. So how do we make sure that the people regulating these new laws are also competent to do so? How do we hold them accountable?
Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff in there. I don't think that's quite what I said about high school. My main point wasn't that everyone has to actually go back to high school and like put on the school uniform again or something. It was that we need to start in high school, right? Because everyone needs to know this stuff. The last place where everyone is learning something and everyone is listening to you is high school. So that's where that sort of mass education, I think, needs to happen. And then one can do education, campaigns and so forth. But continuing on, I had it on, there we go. Sorry, I was looking on the screen to make sure I answered all the different components of it. In terms of you know, the people making the laws, and I think that's what's meant, because I don't know who regulates laws. Maybe, you know, I don't, that's not an expression I fully understand. So if we're sort of saying people who are making the laws, who are making the regulations, are they competent to do so? You know, there's a lot of variability in that. You know, that there are certainly bodies that are expert-based that do have a regulatory role. So standards is an example of that, where standards are made by experts discussing it with other experts, either nationally or internationally, and working on the consensus-based model to come up with a standard for something. The reality is that politicians have a variety of expertise, and we don't live in a we live in a country which is a democracy, not sort of led by experts because of their expertise. So they're going to have a variety of different, you know, they make our laws at the end of the day, and they're not all going to be experts. What you really need is for them to be able to understand what they need to understand to be able to do their job well. That comes down to government departments and the ability of those government departments to do enough consultation to make sure they have a sufficient understanding of whatever it is that they're bringing in laws about. And so, yeah, there's a sort of, you know, operation of government there, where you can sort of bring the expertise in. How do we hold them accountable? Well, if you're talking about the people making the laws, it's a democracy, so you can vote them out. But the high score point comes back there, because I think a lot of people aren't themselves necessarily fully understanding the implications of certain things. So if you look at something like robo-debt, I mean, that wasn't really anything particularly sophisticated in terms of technology. But when that was first rolled out, you know, people didn't know to ask the questions to criticize the government about doing something like that. It was only really after the media grabbed it and explained what was really going on that people were like, oh my God, this is terrible, or at least that was most people's reaction. So, you know, there's an element there of we hold them accountable through democracy. Sometimes we need intermediaries in the media or public advocates who point things out. But if we all have a basic understanding of what can go wrong and the limitations of technology, then we'll all be better citizens, better able to hold government to account, not only for all the things it does, because there are many, but also for how it, what it does in terms of its own technology use and in terms of the laws that it brings in to regulate as well.
Thanks. Hopefully, Jack P, that helps with your question. So our next question is from Guresh, and the question is whether any such regulatory frameworks will really work as boundaries are setting to look backwards, but technology is moving even faster forwards. So how can we control, I guess, tech entrepreneur generation?
Okay, kind of two answers to that. The first is that if we make laws that are about a technology per se, we're never going to keep up, right? So if you look at, you know, and you can look at the history of this. My favorite example that I like to use when I talk about it is digital tapes. I don't know how many people here are old enough to remember digital tapes, but there used to be a whole law in copyright dealing with digital tapes. There was a special tax. So whenever you bought a blank digital tape from Kmart or whatever, you paid a special tax, and that tax would all be collected and given back to the content creators to compensate them for the fact that the digital tapes made perfect copies and could rip off their work, right? There was a whole scheme set up. It actually went all the way to the High Court on various constitutional issues. It was massive, a huge effort. Now, how long were digital tapes the main way people copied anything? I don't know, it might have been a few weeks. You know, it certainly wasn't, you know, it certainly wouldn't have lasted much longer than a year. So if we regulate digital tapes and then we turn around and regulate nanotechnology and then we turn around and regulate artificial intelligence, right? And we keep trying to deal with the technology per se, yeah, it's not going to last. If instead we ask what we want the law to achieve, if instead of saying, how do we regulate X, we say, what is it we're trying to do? What is the harm here? And we focus on those harms, we can actually create laws that operate even as the technology evolves. So to give an example, with AI, one of the big concerns people have is discrimination, right? That people will be treated differently, that you can have hiring algorithms that only hire men and so forth. This is a big part of what people are worried about, right? There's many, but I'll just do one. you could either have an AI law, right, which says, oh, when you have an AI application, you have to do various things about bias, or we can say, actually, we already have discrimination law, right? Let's look at how effective that is in the context of the kinds of applications we're talking about. Let's realize that it's not as effective as we want it to be, that what it encourages organizations to do is often hide the variable rather than test against the variable. And that maybe, given how machine learning works and given how data-driven inferencing works, we actually want to do something different. And then you actually look at the general law. You don't necessarily need a separate law for AI, but you set that up so that it works, whether it's a human or an AI system, right? So that either way, you get the outcome you want and you ensure that certain kinds of bias can't happen in certain kinds of contexts, right? Same as discrimination law does. Similarly, you can look at, what we need to do for privacy law, what we need to do for consumer law. I could keep going, but hopefully that gives a sense, right? What you want to do is pass laws that solve the problem and don't necessarily do so in a technology specific way. Sometimes you need to be technology specific. So if we want to ban human reproductive cloning, or we want to ban autonomous lethal weapon systems, then maybe it is about the tech, but a lot of the time we can actually do it more broadly so that the laws last. Second part of the question, how do you deal with, the fact that, someone can be doing this in their garage and you will never know? Law always has that problem, right? We can prohibit murder, murders happen. We can prohibit domestic violence, and that really happens, right? The law can do lots of things, but it is never going to be, we pass a law and therefore we have 100% perfect compliance. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing, right? So the fact that people still kill people doesn't mean we don't have a law against murder. The fact that we have a law against murder makes a statement that this kind of thing is unacceptable in society. And, where we can catch people, we can lock them up to protect the rest of the people, right? So law has a really important role to play, but I think the idea that it could ever offer some kind of, guarantee that no one will ever invent something and do it anyway is fooling ourselves.
Thanks. And there's a few follow-up questions to that in the chat. If we have time, we'll try and circle back to that. But Carrie has been very active. I think she's put through 4 questions. So we'll try and get maybe to 2 of those. I guess probably we'll start with, where do you rate Australia's privacy regulation and compliance records in a global context? Would you say we are ahead of the game, behind the game, or just kind of on par with countries that are similar to Australia?
Look, I think, it's very hard to say because it's a, 140 odd dimensional problem, right? So there's certain provisions that we're actually really good at and that we probably have, about as good as anywhere. And there are other areas where we can look to other jurisdictions. A lot of people look to Europe, for example, to say, that a lot of the things that the GDPR does are tighter and better than what is in our Privacy Act. But it's not always simple, right? Because it's not always the case that more privacy regulation is better. A lot of it is, can be very controversial as well. So the right to be forgotten or the right of erasure, does that mean that people, that certain kinds of news stories, have to be deleted over time? Does that mean that we can't hear about, someone who committed a rape or a murder after a certain period of time? That there are real complicated questions around that. So you can say Europe's ahead because it's got that right that we don't have in Australia at the moment. It's one we're looking at, but we don't have yet. But it's debatable as to whether that's overall a good thing. And I'll say that Australia, one thing we are really ahead on is we've got a really good consultation process going on at the moment around privacy law reform. So there is an opportunity that the public has had to really engage with some of the proposals that are being considered at the moment in government.
Great. And then we'll do maybe one more from Carrie. So Carrie, hopefully we're picking the 2 questions that were your top 2. But I think this is a great question. So you've talked also about social responsibilities, values, and outcomes. So in your view, is there a case in Australia globally for some sort of independent and responsible agency to both score and make public some kind of social responsibility index?
I think there's always the possibility of such things, right? And there are already organizations doing it in a number of areas. Like there's different certifications you can get, for example, around certain environmental standards and so forth. So these things already exist. And yes, I think they have a really important role to play. And in addition to that, we obviously have the ability for people to say they comply with certain standards where those standards correspond to a particular social value. So there's those as well. So there's different ways of doing it, whether it's a organization that offers a sort of certification thing and so forth, or whether it's just, you know, the ability to go through those other sort of mechanisms like standards. Either way, I think that has a really important role to play, in particular for other organizations that are and individuals that are looking to make decisions about what they buy and what they use.
Okay, great. Carrie, hopefully those were helpful. And I'm sure they were. So the next question is from Sandra. Hi, Lyria, exclamation mark. How do you think we can best control or avoid building human bias into AI decision-making, given that AI is built and programmed by us, the flawed humans?
So really good question. And the answer is it goes back to really thinking about this at a very fundamental level. So various people have written papers about how I think there's, you know, over 20 different fairness metrics, different ways of understanding fairness. And a good example of that problem is a tool that was used in the US in particular, but also in some other countries, to assess risk of offenders, right? And a media organization called ProPublica looked at this tool that was being used to sentence people in parole decisions, bail decisions, etc., and pointed out that there was a higher false positive rate for African Americans, right? In other words, if you were African American, it was more likely that the tool would say you're high risk, even though you would never go on to offend again, right? Now, that is bad, like we don't want that outcome, but the company actually responded and said, well, we have a different fairness metric, which is about the same score having the same risk profile. And on that metric, we actually have demonstrated that white Americans and Black Americans are actually treated the same way. There's a parity on that metric. And the truth is, according again to the mathematicians, you can't actually satisfy both of those metrics at the same time, right? It's not possible. So, you know, and you can never be fair in every sense of the word. Indeed, we have deep political debates about what's fair, right? You know, is it fair to have, you know, in the US to have, you know, people from minority groups to be able to get into university on a point system that advantages them against people who, you know, where they already have a lot of students from that background, right? Is that fair or unfair? I mean, these are complex questions. So I think it's really important to think about what you mean by fairness before you work out how you're going to deal with it. In terms then of how you're going to deal with it, once you know, okay, in this context in which this tool is being used, this is what fairness would mean, right? This is the this is the kind of fairness we mean and is appropriate to this context. Not an easy task, but once you do that, you can test against it, right? So then you really can say, well, we'll build it and we'll try. We can build it into the algorithm, so we can actually make the algorithm optimize against that metric and amongst all the others. We can also evaluate against it. We can really hold ourselves accountable and get a third party to evaluate us against it. So you can do a whole variety of things. There's also standards, again, I know I keep mentioning those, but there are sort of bias standards, both in the ISO and in production at IEEE, that can help sort of understand some of these issues and some of the different terminology, as well as some of the how-tos. So can we ever avoid bias? No, we certainly can't avoid all 30 types at once, but we can absolutely be much more conscious of the decisions we make and how we design and use tools, and which tools we say no to.
Great. I think this will be a very quick question. It's from Monica, and Monica says, it feels as though this topic should be a course offered by Industry Standards Australia for all businesses to put relevant staff through as part of ISO compliance. Does a course like this even exist?
I don't know. is the short answer to that question. Yeah, I'm in Standards Australia, and I've done some of their courses as a committee member. I haven't sort of really looked at their offering, in terms of the general public. I know the government is getting a lot more involved. I was actually just in a meeting today in looking at what Australia's role is in standards. So there might be more coming, but I can't. Sorry, I just don't know the answer.
Knew that'd be a quick one. So the next question is from Anonymous. How safe do you think it is for a day-to-day government's operations to incorporate the adoption of AI technology, and will there be risks?
So this is about government. Sorry, I was trying to
at
find
the ministry level is specific. So it says for a day-to-day government operation, e.g. at the ministerial level, to incorporate the adoption of AI tech. So for day-to-day operations, should we have AI tech if we're kind of in a government role at the ministry level?
I don't see why not. In other words, I don't think, I think there's been a lot of concern because of how it's been done terribly. If you look, everyone uses the RoboDad example, but I'll throw that in. But I also know of a lot of other examples that don't get as much media attention, that a lot of the time this has just been very much, we want to do something, whatever, let's just get a third-party tech company in, throw the tool straight onto the whole population of whatever the relevant part of government does, and it's all good. And I don't think that's a good idea. But absolutely, there are efficiencies in these kinds of tools. From the very basic tool that, we already do that, right? Like, it's not like when you go into a government form to apply for something, there's always a human sitting there, reading through all your answers one by one, right? A lot of the time, the system can tell you you're not entitled to a benefit or whatever it might be, right? Because of the way you've answered the question. So we're already just very basic systems, forget AI, just very basic software tools. AI, if you're looking at the sort of end where there's image recognition, that's getting used when you walk, to make the passport queues more efficient at airports, right? Is that a good use? Yes, as long as you've got two things, I suppose. One is you've got some queue people can go to deal with a human if computer says no, because we know that these tools aren't 100% perfect. And second of all, you want to make sure in that context that you're dealing with some of the main known problems, which are that a lot of these tools can't recognize darker skin, for example. So that's a problem. If it's white people queues and dark people queues, you've got a problem, right? So there's that. In terms of machine learning and data-driven decision-making, much more complicated, right? I'm not saying never, but I think it's a lot more really thinking about what we mean by that and how some people might be treated differently because of choices made by other people. So I was giving that example of the risk assessment tool. That seems to me deeply problematic, to say that we're going to look at your features and compare you to other criminals of the past, and work out what you're likely to do based on what they did. And if you're like them, we're just going to assume you're going to do the same thing. I think that sort of reasoning in the justice system in particular is problematic. But there's all sorts of, really good uses of data-driven decision-making as well. It just depends on the context.
Okay, we're going to try and fit in one more question in the last 4 or 5 minutes. And this is from Probin. So, hi, Lyria, comma, no exclamation mark this time, but that's okay. Given generative AI is even being used to produce creative contents like drafting songs or story plots, what impact do you think this will have on creative thinking? Will this promote groupthink in the future? And will this potentially make people less prone to challenging the status quo?
That is a very big question. Look, I think that at the moment, there's 2 answers to that. First of all, I think there will always be room for human creativity because I think people will want that. Once the excitement and the thrill of the new, of, playing with these things, drops off, people actually want to connect with each other as humans. You go to a theatre and you go watch a play, you're wanting to connect with, profound human questions or laugh because, whatever it might be, but it's a human connection issue. So I think there will always be appreciation for human creativity. I do think there is a real risk that these tools scope what is, put little borders around creativity. I mean, an example I use, and this is from law, but, if you look at what the High Court did in Mabo, when it said, no, we recognize native title, no, Australia was not terra nullius, it's very hard to imagine an AI system, even a sophisticated one, being able to actually break with everything that had come before in terms of the policy, the politics, the previous, case law, and say, that is actually all wrong, and we need to rethink our, rethink, what happened in 1788 and what Indigenous people's rights to land are today as a result of that. I just think, it's not going to do that kind of creativity, right? It's not, it doesn't, it's a copying kind of creativity, if I can call it that. So it can be different and it can do something new, but it doesn't really, do the sort of really important acts that I think need to happen in society. It's not going to be the first to do something completely different. And it's always going to operate within its programming. I think that, part of why humans can be creative is that they operate outside of programming, right? So, and I understand, machine learning isn't programmed line by line, but it's still programmed with an objective. Some human still decides it will optimize X, right? And I can't program that into my children. Right, they will go and they will do something completely unexpected and beyond my expectations, hopefully in a good way. But I think part of the creativity is the fact that it is not controlled.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to read one more comment, not a question. This is also from an anonymous attendee. It says, not a question, we just want to say, I love your passion, Lyria, when you present. Thank you. And I guess just on behalf of everyone in Learn to Lead, myself included, thank you so much for taking the time, for being with us today, and for the contributions of the course, because I mean, this is also an area that's very near and dear to myself. So I really love hearing your perspective every time we talk. And so, yeah, so I think we're going to wrap up there. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and just for engaging and having really thoughtful and provoking questions. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. The next session will be 2 days from now, Thursday, 15th of June, with Professor Mary Ann Williams as a part of Module 4, Leading Innovation. So hope you are all continuing to enjoy the course, and thank you so much. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever it is that you are in the world. And we will see you in about 48 hours. Have a great day, everyone.